Hello, Year 9. I'm afraid you only have me today for the video, mainly because we have decided that I am going to take over the Year 9 projects for now. And so I thought that I'd continue with the videos. Might as well, considering I think quite a few of you have appreciated the fact that we've made them. So I thought I would carry on with them. This week we're going to look at War Photographer by Ann Duffy. War Photographer is a fantastic poem which explores the morals behind photographing people in war zones, basically. I've attached the poem to the project, so have a little read through the poem. I'm not going to necessarily do that with you now. I'm just going to talk through the themes and ideas that Ann Duffy puts into this poem. First of all, just jumping back to what I said about morals. Obviously, morals are what is right and what is wrong. And obviously this poem sparks a lot of debate about whether it is moral to photograph somebody in a war zone. So if you think, for example, that a bomb has just gone off, there are journalists in the area, and the journalists rush in to the aftermath of this explosion that's gone off. Lots of people have been severely injured. Lots of people have been killed. It's considering the moment where a war photographer or a journalist would have to make a choice between whether to help somebody, potentially saving their life, or photograph them. And obviously there's an argument for both sides, because photographing them means that you can send images back to your home country. They can go into the newspapers and people can gain a much deeper understanding of what's actually going on in these places. But that person who's making that choice then has to live with their decision. And if they chose to take a photograph, because obviously that's how they earn their money, and then that person died, then that becomes something that they have to live with then for the rest of their life. If we look back to Remains, which we looked at last week, the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder, and this idea that you can be haunted by an image for the rest of your life and you just can't get rid of it. This is a similar thing. Do these war photographers get haunted by what they see? I think specifically in this poem, this speaker, this war photographer, does get haunted by what he sees. Specifically in stanza 3, when he talks about the strangest features appearing in front of him on the paper, and how he remembers the man. As soon as he sees his face, he remembers the scenario, and he remembers this man, he remembers his wife, he remembers how she was screaming, and so he then is reminded of that situation. I think it's important for this poem that you understand what a darkroom is. If you do know what a darkroom is, then you can whiz on a bit, but if you don't, it's the reason I think I need to explain it is because we don't necessarily have things like this anymore, because we live in a digital age when photographs are just put straight onto computers. Before that was the case, we would have dark rooms, which are basically sort of a form of science lab. Photography is just science, really. And what happens in a dark room is you block out all of the light, because obviously photographs used to be completely reliant on light. And what happens when you take a photograph is the shutter of the camera opens for a second and it allows light through the lens, which then hits the film, which is behind the lens. And then that is how the image is saved and imprinted. And then what you'd have to do is you'd have to take that into a dark room and then take the film out of the camera. And obviously the only way you can take the film out of the camera is if the room is completely pitch dark, because otherwise whatever light is in the room, it will completely ruin the film, because that's how photographs are made. So you take the film into a completely pitch dark room, there's a series of chemicals that you have to put the film in, which basically sets it, which means that no more light can change it. And then once that's happened, then light can touch that film and nothing can happen to it. Then you basically shine another light through that film onto a bigger piece of paper in exactly the same process, and then you use chemicals to make it develop. What I can do actually is I can try and find a link to a documentary which talks you through that process. And I think it's quite important to know about that process in order to understand how these images are fading into view in front of him, and how he slowly sees them developing. And it's almost like as they're developing, his memory of what he saw and what he went through is slowly developing as well. Which again highlights how much strife and pain he must see, because he can't necessarily differentiate and remember specific moments. But once the photographs are developed, then they remind him again of those moments and what he felt at those times. The other really interesting thing about this poem is the debate about whether newspapers are read in the right way, and whether we as receivers of news from other countries care enough about what's going on. And I think that the answer is no, we don't. I think that human beings generally are very much focused on what's going on around them over what's going on around in places that we don't necessarily relate to. So, for example, if something awful happened in England, you would possibly care about it a lot more than if something happened in Syria, because you haven't necessarily been to Syria, you can't necessarily relate. So, thus the importance of war photographers showing us these images. But he's saying that in spite of these images, we don't care. And it's a really interesting debate about our morals as receivers of news. Do we really care, or do we look at these images and go, oh my gosh, that's awful, and then that afternoon we're over it? And that's why in the last stanza, where he talks about 100 agonies in black and white, he's created these hundreds and hundreds of photographs of awful things happening to people. They go into the newspapers, people read them, their eyes get a bit teary, slightly, maybe a little bit watery, and then it says between the bath and pre-lunch beers. So they sort of have a bit of a look at a newspaper between the time when they've had a bath and when they go for a bit of a social at the pub. And then they forget about it. And so he's basically saying that he does all this work, he goes out to all of these places and he photographs all these awful things, and he's sort of questioning what he's even doing it for, because people look at it and don't care and forget about it. And so the last line then in that case is really powerful, because he says, from the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. So he flies off again in an aeroplane to another awful place where he's going to see awful things and have to photograph it to send it back to his editor. And he's looking down at the land below him. He's looking down at England, and he's just thinking that none of them care about what he's doing. And so what is the point? It's got a sense of unfulfillment. I think that he feels like what he is doing is pointless because nobody seems to be affected by it. And I think it's quite important to think about moments, especially from that part of the world, war-torn countries, places where they have a lot of strife and a lot of suffering, current wars that are going on that we are not necessarily involved in directly. Can you think of any times when you have been more affected than others? Because I can think of a very specific time when I was far more affected than I ever had been before. And it was during the immigration. It was during the time when lots of Syrian refugees were fleeing and trying to get into Europe, trying to get into Britain. And I think that we saw a lot of things in the newspapers about how bad it was and how we had to lock down our borders, and people were sailing off in ridiculous boats that were never going to stay afloat. And they were dying. And I think that we didn't really know what that meant until I remember I saw an image in the newspaper of a little boy who had been swept up. He'd awfully, unfortunately, died at sea. And his body was washed up onto a beach in a completely different country. And to me, that really, really hit home what was going on, and the fact that people were so desperate to leave these awful countries that they were putting their little children onto these dangerous boats and just sailing off into the sea and not knowing where they were going to end up. But anything was better than staying in those countries. And I think that it's images like that that really need to be shown in order to help people understand what's going on. So I do believe that there's a place for war photographers. I do believe that there is a purpose, and I do believe that we do need to know what is going on in the rest of the world in order to be educated, in order to be empathetic and sympathetic, and be better people, because we can understand what people are going through. But the choice between whether to help or to take a photograph, I don't know, I'm still a bit torn. But have a read through the poem, see what you think. It is very well written. I think it's very well delivered. I'm going to include a recording of myself reading the poem, just so that you can hear how it is read and what specific parts are emphasised. So have a little listen to that. I'll attach that to the lesson as well. Enjoy. Take care, everybody. Bye.